formally introduced to Mr. Van Dyke.
Yes, we were on a USD 383 Diversity Commission meeting yesterday. So nice to meet you, Greg.
So we, I believe, are all well met. And Suzanne, when you tell us go, that you've started, oh, you have started recording, it's red. As I said in my email, I'm going to do my best to keep this as conversational as possible, but this is your conversation. This is a group product. So I've created some structural questions to get us started, but that's really what they are, is just launch points. And I do have a rather formal introduction that our CC committee agreed really should be made. And so if you don't mind, if you're ready, I'm going to launch that introduction that sets us where we are today. Is that okay? Y'all ready?
Good.
Yes.
Do open your chat box. Let's have the chat box open because I think we'll be able to make use of it. I see some comments are already there. Very good. All right. Well, this continues our series, Community Conversation on Race and Conciliation, which I'm going to abbreviate as CCRR. It's less of a mouthful. This is a set of small group discussions that are designed to explore the issues and to model the qualities of dialogue that we hope become the norm in our community here in Manhattan, Kansas. My name is Donna Schenck-Hamlin. I'm a member of the steering committee for CCRR. And you can find our Facebook page at Manhattan KS Conversations. That's one character string with the capital C of conversations, all the others in lowercase. Our invited guests to today's conversation are Mr. Greg Van Dyke, a graduate of Manhattan High School, class of 2019, am I right? And undergraduate at Wichita State University, majoring in criminal justice. Ms. Usha Reddi, our mayor of Manhattan. Ms. B. Stoney, associate professor of physical and multicultural education at K-State. Today is Juneteenth. It's a day of remembrance for the end of slavery. On June 19th in 1865, we're reminded that the end of the Civil War and the liberation of slaves was announced in Galveston, Texas by the Union Army, although the Emancipation Proclamation had been made 2.5 years earlier. Emancipation and liberation are promising concepts, but the promise hasn't yet been fulfilled, as our recent history illustrates again and again. In this extraordinary time of action and reaction, when many see historical crisis point being reached here, the demands for attention, for listening, learning, reflection, and maybe even innovation seem to be all converging. CCRR, as I'm going to call it, began 2 years ago as a Manhattan initiative to focus our attention on race, to listen and learn from our diverse community members in order to correct the wrongs that have been perpetuated in the name of race, and to create a community that works for collaboration and for understanding. Since conversation is the currency of social capital and CCRR works to promote productive conversations, we do this through large and small scale dialogues. And because of this time of social distancing, we're using this small group conversation, but shared with a larger community later on, to share our thoughts and our experiences on race and on reconciliation. Our steering committee for CCRR practices conversations ourselves that are grounded in principles of respect, equality, and responsibility. And we've encapsulated these principles in a few ground rules that we try to follow for the duration of any given discussion. We've encapsulated these as suspend judgment, or in other words, approach different viewpoints during a conversation with curiosity, listen to deepen our understanding, and in an online context, whether you're texting or talking, demonstrating good listening by connecting our responses to what has already been said or by asking questions of each other. Express your own voice, speaking of what you have lived and believed and encountered. Embrace intensity. We're here to hear the hard stories, and this is valuable even if it's hard work. And ultimately, and I hope I'm not breaking this rule right now, respect time limits to ensure that everybody can contribute. Would anybody like to comment on these ground rules or suggest other guidelines that in your experience helps discussion? We good with those? I think we can manage over the next hour to do that. Okay, thank you. We'll start now. During this week, we're remembering those who continue to suffer the lasting effects of racial bigotry and suppression. I'm reminded by a radio program that this week is the 5-year remembrance of the Charleston massacre at Bethel AME. It's marked this week in the midst of large-scale and continuous protests across the country against deadly police violence directed at African Americans. So given this setting, how does what is happening today in the nationwide street protests influence your thoughts about conditions here in Manhattan? And I will go round robin with this first question, and then I think we'll just popcorn it after that. I'm going to start with Ms. Stoney. Again, how does what is happening today in the nationwide street protest influence your thoughts about conditions here in our town in Manhattan, Kansas? Ms. Stoney?
Sure. Well, first of all, Donna, thank you for this opportunity and CCRR for having important dialogues, given what we have experienced over the last month, basically, post George Floyd's death. Excuse me. How what has happening in the country influenced my thoughts about conditions here in there in Manhattan, because I'm not in Manhattan right now. I found things to be quite challenging. I appreciate the fact that there have been both peaceful protests and in a sense has brought the Manhattan community together. How it influenced me is this, is what happens after we are a month post George Floyd and how Manhattan begins to begin healing. Healing takes some time. And we have to remember that in the process of healing, we also have to look at how are we coming together as a community to really listen to what we are saying and what we are talking about. And the experiences, not only for Black people, but for brown people and basically people of color. This has been a long time in the works, I should say, because I would say in the past, we have not, in Manhattan, have not done a good job in having the open communications around issues, whether it's dealing with the police or dealing with just your next door neighbor. We haven't had the opportunities to do this. And I think that this situation of Mr. Floyd's has opened up a lot of opportunities that has always been there for Manhattan, but we didn't know how to start the conversations, how to come together. And I appreciate the fact that this has really caused us to stop and pause and to listen. And I mean, not just hear, but to listen to the words and the experiences of others that live in Manhattan, that reside in Manhattan, but also the experiences of what is it really like to be in Manhattan. And I have to say that, like I said, I'm in Portland, Oregon right now. And in Portland, I have to say that what I've witnessed here has brought a community together in a way that it hasn't. Usually you have your Black community doing what they need to do, your white community, your Indian community, et cetera, et cetera. But watching what I have witnessed here, and that is bringing people together. And I mean, as a march of togetherness that I have never seen. And I caught a few things that occurred in Manhattan with the peaceful riots, which I appreciated. And I just love the beauty of just watching the rainbow of people just wanting to come together for not just a simple cause, but for a important cause. And that cause is, how can we, as Manhattanites, work together every day, all day, suspending judgment, and continue to this dialogue, or to continue being able to work together so that we know how to be people, just peaceful people.
Those were a whole string of pearls. There's a lot of good thoughts there. Mr. Van Dyke, I'd like to ask you next how that large national picture is translating to your thoughts. And like Ms. Stoney, you're commuting from Manhattan to Wichita, so perhaps this calls up comparisons with what you're seeing in Wichita to Manhattan. Can you dig into that?
Yes, and again, thank you for allowing space for this. Thank you for allowing me to join this. This is just wonderful, and these conversations definitely need to be had with multiple different people across the nation. But first off, let me say Manhattan's not a bad place. Manhattan just has a lot of work to do, like multiple cities across the U.S. And I can't necessarily speak for Wichita because I'm still in Manhattan currently. I won't be in Wichita until July 1st. But these are just kind of piggybacking off of what Mrs. Stoney had said. These issues have always, been there. It's just now people are finding ways to communicate and talk about that. And I think it's a beautiful thing. I think it's definitely conversations that need to be had. As I see in Manhattan, the reason that I joined different committees and I started work at the high school level and whatnot was because I saw that there needed to be a change happening. And that's what I see in Manhattan. Like I said, it's not a bad place. It just needs changes in certain areas. We have our own fair share of issues on discrimination and more specifically race. But it's how we handle those situations that matter the most. I've been able to go out to a protest here in Manhattan, a peaceful one where there was people of different colors, people of different backgrounds, peacefully marching down Anderson Avenue. And it was a beautiful thing to see us all come together, but it's also important that lasts. It's not that you just come out for one time, say you had a piece in it, and then don't ever talk about it again. But it's important that these conversations continue to further go through and keep being talked about, because in 2 years, we want to make sure that we're not having these same situations again, because these conversations are still being held. And I just believe change starts first in our families. How we're raising up our children, what we're teaching them at home is important. If we teach them history, if we teach them that there's more than just one kind of person in this world, if we teach them that there's different people from different backgrounds, starting in our own families, if we are able to open up our homes for these different type of conversations, then transferring into the schools, if the schools open it up, and I know there might be a limited edition on what schools can and cannot say and what schools can and cannot teach, but if we're able to open up our conversations in these schools, because there are multiple different students in the high school level, in the college level, in the middle school level, elementary level, of students of different backgrounds. And so I think it's important to open up the classroom for those conversations to an extent. Then that goes on to the jobs as well. Jobs are diverse. You have to open up allow these conversations to be had. And I think that'll improve and help push for change drastically.
Ms. Reddi, can you add to that?
Yes, thank you, Donna, and the CCRR for having us here this morning. I do appreciate being part of this group. I'm glad you have representation from USD 383, especially a current student graduate and from K-State University, Kansas State University and the city. You know, race has always been a part of my life, and Dr. Stoney and I have had many conversations about race, and we have been intricately involved in lots of policies and discussions and venting, and at the same time working towards change. It doesn't happen by itself. So I feel very honored and privileged that the city of Manhattan elected me to represent them. And oftentimes you wouldn't think when people come in, typically at this time we have a lot of welcomes and ribbon cuttings, and that's not happening right now. But I always took great pleasure when people would come to our community and say, this is Mayor Reddi. You would never expect an Indian woman to be mayor of Manhattan, Kansas, because the perception is we are conservative, it's all white, and that's the way it is. But we're not. The humanity, Manhattan is wonderful. And like I said, I represent people that whether they voted for me or not, whether they are rich, poor, black, white, whatever race they are. Once you are elected, you represent all 50,000 of them. And I really do, I do not take that for granted. But at the same time, race is front and center. As a public school teacher, you know, working with my African-American students and their families, Mexican students, all of them. We had a lot of transient population, and now in my role as city official, it is front and center. When I walk in the room, that's the first thing you see, a woman of color, and then you move on to let's see what credentials she has to offer. And I think that's something we all face when you are not white. But that doesn't mean that we are not for change. So whether it's economic development, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's working with our partners, how we carry ourselves and leading by example is at a higher, we are held to a higher expectation. And more often than not, we excel at that because we know we represent a whole lot of people. And I think that's what this incident happened, you know, with George Floyd. It just elevated it to all of these policies we have in place. Being a peaceful community didn't happen by itself. You know, we have co-responders that we had to fit for our RCPD, body cameras, de-escalating techniques that they're all being trained on, having policies in place with the city commission as far as getting sexual orientation and gender identity become part of our protected class, working with Douglas Center, that wasn't happening, and to expand it and make it a better recreation center. These things happen with people at the table, and it takes years to happen. We are not where we need to be, but we are certainly going in the right direction, and we can have more people at the table for that conversation. I try to put as many diverse people on advisory boards as possible, and everything is very deliberate and purposeful because you need to invite them. You know, you're going to have 100 people, 10 people say no before you find that one that says yes. And that's true for any population. So I think that's our task. All of these people are out there, they want to do something, and we want to give them something to do that works for them and their time schedule and their lifestyle at this time. So once again, I'm honored to be here this morning, and I look forward to more dialogue. Thank you.
I want to encourage popcorn behavior, but we'll have to signal or indicate to each other that we want to respond to what somebody says. I was taken by a word that jumped out for me in what you just said, Usha, when you said transience. And Manhattan has many transient members, military, students, people who call this home for a short time. What have you all seen the impact of perceptions among people who regard themselves as more permanent representatives of Manhattan, Kansas, in their interactions with or their influence by people who are here for a short time, who call this Manhattanites? Did you get that? It says my internet connection is unstable. How does the concept of being a transient member, and the other term that I might say was representative, as a representative of Manhattan, how are you seeing that play out?
Yeah, well, I'll take a first swing at this. I'm very proud of us being a transient community. And I think once we embrace that, we will feel more comfortable. So we don't, at least in my experience, we haven't seen this, you're an outsider. I think most often the experience people have in Manhattan forever, however long they are here, they're often greeted with a smile, a nod, a wave, something saying, affirming that, hey, we acknowledge you, you're in our community. I hope you're, enjoy your time here. And I think that's something to take great pride in. It takes a lot to get there. Even when we have, students and there's lots of traffic going on, people are still comfortable being around each other. But at the same time, we don't have a diverse number of events. Our events are very, to one particular demographic, whether it's football, athletics, whatever it might be, even our music events, they're catered to a certain demographic. Our businesses are catered to certain, more predominantly to more majority demographic than the minority demographic. And I think that's something we can be better at, because ultimately we want them to come and be transient, but we also want them to say, hey, this is a town I can live in. I think I wouldn't mind moving here. This is wonderful. And we've had military that have, once they retired, came and lived in Manhattan. We have a lot of people that come here for a job and say, oh, I'll just stay there 1 or 2 years, and end up staying here 27 years later. And, we want that. We want that comfortable feeling of a small town, good schools, good natured people, and trying to make it better for everybody. And there are negatives to it, because at the same time, you don't know we want them to stay and spend money and enjoy it here, but we also want them to establish businesses here. And what does that take? So that's an ongoing conversation to make Manhattan a better place for everybody. And we often lose our minority populations to bigger cities like Kansas City or everything else like that. So we need to do a little bit better at it. But I think I'm proud that we are a transient community.
Ms. Stoney, Mr. Van Dyke, do
I'll
those
go
terms?
ahead and
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and jump in, because what came to mind was permanent residents versus transient residents. And excuse me, while like Mary Reddi said, you're welcome here, but also there's a sense of, but don't stay long. We like our small town feel. Because, and I say that because when I recall moving to Manhattan, while it was very welcoming on one level, it was also, so how long are you staying here? And here I am 21 years later, I'm still in Manhattan. But, and I agree, there's certain communities where certain things that happen in Manhattan that it divides the community. And unfortunately, here's a prime example, like Aggieville. Aggieville is a division for the students versus the Manhattanites, or the campus, I should say. But yet when we go into, we meaning the folks who pay taxes there, so to speak, fall into Aggieville, oftentimes, and this is just me personally, oftentimes I'm looked at as, why are you here? Well, I want to be there in Aggieville. I want to spend money. I want to make sure that, the businesses are thriving. But yet at the same time, and maybe it's an age different thing, I'm not really sure, but I find that Manhattan can be a great place to be in, but I also find Manhattan to be a place where I don't want to be there. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean it in a welcoming sense. Like I said, your time is temporary with most of our transit people who come through. But yet I would like to see our folks who live there permanently to be just a little bit more welcoming to our transient population, because they do have a lot to bring to the community. They do have a lot to offer. They do have the opportunity to become entrepreneurs and open businesses, but we also have to be welcoming to those folks when they do come through. Thank you.
Greg.
And I would also argue that I think Manhattan is also, a friendly community. I can go down into a Walmart and have a conversation with somebody I never even knew. I can go down to the gas station and wave at somebody I never knew. So I think it is very friendly in a sense, but I do also agree with Mayor Reddi and Mrs. Stoney that I think the more permanent people, I've noticed, when people start to get set in their ways, it becomes hard for change to occur and take place. And what I mean by that is when somebody has been resided in a place in their life, not even just physically, but also maybe like mentally, when they've resided in a place for a majority of their life, that becomes their normal and it becomes their permanent way of how they choose to do something. Um, but that's why I invoke and I preach about change so much to people, because me myself, not to boast or nothing, but I always try to get a different perception of everybody. I try to put myself in different people's shoes so I can see how you feel, because then I think that gives a sense of more understanding, more friendliness. If somebody was able to come into Manhattan for the first time, I want to welcome them with open arms and let them know I'm going to be here for them if they need anything, because although Manhattan might be small, there's some neighborhoods I've never even been through and I might need, direction through, or I might need guidance through, or, because we're a college town and everybody loves K-State, they might need help understanding the culture or the background of Manhattan. So, if we're able to have those different conversations and be more friendly about it, um, more willing to open up our mind and change our way of thought and perception, I think that'll be beneficial.
I'm glad you mentioned something about neighborhoods. I grew up in Los Angeles and I grew up knowing the freeways and which freeway exits you might want not to take, and being cautious as you proceeded through the LA Valley as to, knowing where you were. One thing that surprised me when I came to Manhattan is that I quickly learned all of the neighborhoods, and I've never, as a white person, of course, felt unwelcome or edgy anywhere I walk. And I walked a lot, not having a car for the first 10 years. But that's quite a difference from living in a megalopolis. Now, Ms. Stoney, you're in Portland, Oregon, and you know that that's different than being in Manhattan, because you're not going to cover the same territory in your typical routes. And I'm hearing us talk a lot about life in general and the signals we give one another as relative strangers, but as resident in Manhattan in general, to put on the welcoming face or to behave in such a way as to signal to other residents that they are on it, that they are all members of this community. That's in general. As events push us into specific conversations because of tensions that are occurring nationally, and because we are trying to change actively the way certain collective entities, organizations, institutions, social groups behave that signal racial tensions. And I think we can all recall those incidents in Manhattan's recent history that have signaled racial tensions. We're not at the general anymore. We're at the specific conversations. And I want to talk a little bit about the challenges to initiating and conducting conversations that we feel must be had, whether it's among peers, among coworkers. How do we launch those, and what makes it hard? Let's start with some of the challenges. Mr. Van Dyke.
So in high school, the last 2 years of my, while I was in high school, I was the president of the Black Student Union. And a lot of my, I forgot the word, a lot of the other students in my grades knew that I was the president of the BSU. but they wouldn't take time to. I would invite different people from different backgrounds, no matter if you're white, black, Asian, Hispanic, whatever. I would invite you to our meetings, because I think it's essential that if I'm learning about your history and your culture, you can sit down and learn about mine possibly. You know, I want to be open armed with that. But a lot of people just, I think people have a tendency to go and follow the majority. If a lot of the people don't go and have these conversations, they won't want to step up and have these conversations. So I say that as we have more followers than we do leaders, which is, I mean, we do need people following, yes. We also need people to step up and take initiative. And that's why I did take some of these roles in my life. But I also think it's perception. I think how people have a point of view that hinders them. If they're not open to think a different way, like I had mentioned earlier, if they're not open to a different way of thinking, then it's going to be very challenging for them to even hear what I'm trying to say as a Black man. Even dealing with like maybe some teachers in the school, because they might have more age on me, it makes them think that I'm just a child. I don't know any better. I don't know what I'm talking about, type of sense. But I think it's just very hard to have these conversations because people just simply aren't willing to. I think that's the hardest thing about race is people are not willing to change the state of mind that they're in. But once we break that barrier, I think it's going to be so much easier. I hear people often say, well, I don't see, I'm colorblind. They say I'm colorblind. I don't see your color. And the thing is, I want you to see me. I want you to embrace our differences so we can find common ground in between. I think that's going to be the easiest thing. But like I said, until you can reach that point where people can start to change their way of thinking, it's going to be hard to have these conversations.
I'm reminded actually of an incident about 20 years ago when somebody came up to me in a grocery store and invited me to something that she called Adventures in Attitudes. Well, let me tell you, my first reaction was, what? I need an attitude change. So I had that knee-jerk reaction of Adventures in Attitudes, and she was inviting me. So the invitation can be hard. What about spontaneity? What about amongst people we know? How do we get started? Anybody want to throw out an incident from their own experience that allowed them to launch? This may take some time to recall. Of course, you mentioned positions. It's my official position as the head of BSU, and then people start recognizing that's your role. So an official invitation to a conversation that is guaranteed to be safe and is hopefully to be productive, like the one today, a person can accept it or reject it.
You talk about the invitation was hard. You know, my question back to you was, what was so hard about the invitation? That's just it. People of color are always asking white people to join in, but oftentimes that's not reciprocated. And therein lies the problem when we're trying to have these difficult conversations. I personally think the conversations are difficult because it depends on where you are in your experiences. If you're not used to, say for example, if you're in your, I like to say tribe constantly, which means your race, your ethnic identities, if you're always in that circle and you're having just simple conversation, it's hard to walk into a different circle and have those same conversations because in fear of confrontation. I want to have the confrontation because I want to know your platform. I want to know what you're thinking, what are those experiences, but I also want to share with you the opportunities to learn something new, to learn something about people you don't know about or their backgrounds. You know, and I hear a lot of people say, well, it's difficult to talk about race. Well, it probably is, but you know, we're in America. We have a lot of racial issues. We have a lot of American history that's not really nice to talk about. And I say that because I just had a student in my online class, a white young male, said, I didn't like the chapter we read because it made me face, as a white male with privilege, the true history of America and the way we as white people treated people of color, particularly Black people. It blew me away. And he said, this is the first time I have felt safe enough and comfortable enough to make this comment. He said, because I have to really take a look at myself. He said, well, I realized those are my ancestors. I'm not doing that today. He said, because I can recognize I do have white privilege. He said, but I need to figure out how to make these changes. And he said, and the hardest part for me is having a conversation. It's opening the dialogue to people who look like me. And I said to him, I said, Kyle, pseudonym name. I said, here's the thing. I need to know when I'm not in a room as a person of color and you're in a room with all white men or all white people, I need to know you're going to be my voice. You're going to need to be very comfortable in talking about, well, wait a second. According to, that didn't really happen this way because of the experiences I've learned about Dr. Stoney or about another person of color. This is what I've learned. I said, I need to know you're going to be that strong voice in the room. I said, because that's how conversations begin to change. That's how conversations begin to become a little bit comfortable. It takes a while, you know, but if it's difficult to have these conversations, people will never grow. We'll never grow. We'll always use that excuse. It's difficult to talk about and just fill in the blanks. It's difficult because you don't want to face the music. You have to be able to face the music in order to see, you know, who we are. Like Mr. Van Dyke said, you know, colorblind. I just love when people say I'm colorblind. I'm sorry. There are three things you see about me when I walk into the room. The fact that I'm a woman of color, the fact that I am female, and then what I'm wearing. You know, you can't be colorblind. We can't be colorblind to what we see. We have to open our eyes and say, hey, I'm uncomfortable. But you know what? You have to be uncomfortable to grow. Because if you're going to stay in that comfort zone, you never want to grow. You're going to have the status quo of, that doesn't pertain to me, so therefore I don't have to deal with it. But I'm sorry, yes, you do. We live in a community, we live in a world that's so diverse that be curious, you know, be curious about people, but don't be ignorant at the same time. You know, my students always say, well, how do I ask a person, how do they, you know, what's their racial group? I said, simple. How do you identify yourself racially and or ethnically? Because now you're giving that person the opportunity to tell you how they describe their identity as opposed to you describing their identity for them. We got to get beyond those experiences of comfort. We have to move into that uncomfortable zone in order to learn more about people. People choose their words so carefully when they're in mixed groups because they're afraid that they don't want to be seen as racist or they don't want to appear to be ignorant. I'm a firm believer. Put it out there. Let's decipher it. Let's talk about it. Because if you're going to be careful in choosing your words, the conversation is no longer authentic. It becomes by choice.
Ms. Reddi, you've been in uncomfortable situations as a public figure and you've watched uncomfortable people approach the mic at City Hall. What occurs to you on that?
I think being a first grade teacher is the best thing that ever happened to me because you learn to use language and you learn to know that words matter. And one of the things I've realized from my teaching profession is the word and parenting, you want to use words where they're going to listen to you because some people get stuck on a word and feel triggered and never move past it. So they never hear the real issue. And words, when I was on the diversity commission, one of the things we always talk about is training our teachers. Well, everybody feels like, why do I need that again? Why do I need a diversity training again? You know, I'm not racist, I'm fine. Why do we need to do this? And they go through the training, they go through the motions, and then they move on with life. So the point of being a non-racist as opposed to an anti-racist is what Dr. Stoney was referencing, is that are you a bystander? Are you silent? Do you even recognize it? You know, we don't it's like with sexual harassment. For a long time, people were just bystanders, and we learned that you can't be a bystander. You need to call people out. And now we are at that same point with race. The Black experience is very different than me as an Indian experience. And we need to acknowledge that piece as well. Racism looks different for each group. And I think when I was teaching, I know how my African-American boys were treated differently than other boys. I know research has continuously shown that, you know, a 4-year-old in preschool, if you're a Black young boy, 4-year-old, you'll get more often they get suspended than anybody else. And that sticks with you. Therefore, you get disillusioned with school. You might drop out, might not have college aspirations. You're in remediation forever. And you can be the gifted student, but you will never be recognized for it. And I think that's part of it. I think my role is also the microaggressions, but also taking care of these Amy Coopers. So the Amy Cooper in New York, who is, I would have to assume, a progressive Democratic woman who has a great job and thinks she is well versed in world issues and in social social arenas and social justice systems. Yet when she sees an African-American man telling her, you need to put your dog on a leash in a public park, and she disobeys that, not disobeys it, she refuses to listen to it and says, clearly, I'm going to call the police and tell them there's an African-American man assaulting me and my dog. Those were her words. So she knew the idea of race. She was going to call the cops, and then she did call the cops and said it 3 times. And if Christian Cooper did not leave that situation, once she leashed her dog and left it, cops would have come and we don't know what would have happened. You know, we're at that mentality, if it's a tall African man, shoot first and talk later sometimes, especially if the woman is calling and saying, I'm being assaulted in a hysterical manner. So this is someone like Amy, who I might feel fine in a social gathering and who might be a friend of mine, but those are the things we need to look at. You know, we are all racist at some level. So if you are on a street or in a park with an African-American man, as opposed to a white man, what would you do? And I think that's the discussion we need to have. And it's not just about a discussion that's one time, it's an ongoing everyday thing where you're constantly leading by example and just asking. If I say, hey, you know what, don't use that word. You know, I'm not good with people using foul words all the time. I don't use it. I don't want the people I'm around to use it. Words matter. And I think we need to be at that point where we are all comfortable saying, you know what, that's not right. You know, let's just move on. That's disrespectful. And as a teacher, that's what I learned, even in city commission meetings. When somebody says something that I don't agree with, and sometimes it is about race or whatever it might be, social issues, I have to say, I don't agree with that. That's not the way I would think. Let's move on from the conversation or something like that, because you don't want to divert that attention to attacking. If people feel like, well, you're attacking me, you're saying I'm a racist, I can't handle this. And we need to get to the point where we can have those difficult conversations, but sometimes the terms are different in the settings you are in, but it definitely needs to happen. And I think we're getting better at it. We are finally recognizing the words Black Lives Matter, and that's huge. And I think from there, we can have the more difficult conversations we are talking about.
Great. Mr. Van Dyke.
You're good. And one thing that she pointed out that I think is so important is that you have to be willing to speak up and speak out. I know at such a young age, whether it being in middle school or in high school, I was afraid to speak up when I knew something was wrong because I was a follower. I was trying to fit in. I was trying to be like everybody else. But I also knew I was different. And I knew if I spoke up that I might receive backlash from people. And I didn't know how to handle that at the time. But one thing is, no matter what, you have to be willing to speak up and take charge of those conversations, kind of like Mayor Reddi was saying. If you disagree with something, nobody's ever going to know that you disagree with it if you're silent. Nobody's ever going to know that they might be thinking wrong or they might have the facts wrong if they don't speak up. I was appalled by what Mrs. Stoney had said about the student that came to her. You know, she put a scenario of, if I'm not there and you're in a room full of all white people, are you going to speak up if somebody is saying something wrong? I think that's important when we're drawing people to the table and asking them to do this. It's also the representation that is important. Also, having the representation of people who are willing to speak up and speak out no matter what's going to happen, because you know, if you start to speak up and speak out, it might encourage somebody else to speak up and speak out, and it might be a cycle because you're breaking the chain, you know. So
What about inviting those conversations in normal social interaction? We've talked about reacting when somebody uses a trigger word, but what about even raising the issue? How many of you ever were asked, so how long have you lived in Manhattan? That's very common currency. And it does sometimes seem off-putting, even if it wasn't intended to be so. I have a lot of international friends who, as soon as an accent is detected, where are you from? Are there any idiomatic expressions that could serve us as tools to open up conversations about difference that are seeking diverse experiences, taking the temperature? I might have as easily asked somebody, how friendly has Manhattan struck you? How easy or difficult has it been for you to get acquainted in Manhattan? Or some other kind of idiomatic tool that opens up diverse conversations. Have any of you witnessed or tried those kinds of openers?
Well, first of all, you have to suspend judgment. Just because I may have an accent or not, you're already judging me when the moment I said hello. But the thing is, when those types of idioms, even I'm asked, so where are you from? Well, I have to tell them where I'm from. And then the next question is, so where do you work? Oh, I work at K-State. Oh, so are you in facilities? Yeah, I'm nothing to the folks in facilities. They do great work at the university. And I said, well, what makes you think I'm in that particular department? Well, or are you military? I love that one. But I said, what makes you think I work in that particular department? Well, you know, that's where the majority of our African-American people on campus work. Now, how about I'm a faculty in the College of Education? Well, what do you do? Are you administrative assistant? When I'm very clear in what I am, how I'm responding to their question. But the thing is, see, you've already judged me and you don't even know. And even though I am sharing, you're still looking through those rose-colored glasses lenses and how you are portraying me or designing me, or as I tell my students, construct me and tell me what you think. And it's quite worrisome as a person of color to make the assumption that this is the only way you can view me, even though I'm sharing with you my own personal experiences. You're not hearing me. And for me, I look at it, I receive it this way. Okay, so you have your white lens, you're gonna keep it this way, because like I tell my students, and I have to share this quick story, is I tell my students, there are 3 sets of tapes we have in our lives. Our first set of tapes are birth to 18, where we were raised by our parents, we're influenced by our parents, and parents are great. I have no objections to how you were raised. However, from 18 to 24, which is when we begin to start learning about different things on this side of our tapes, they're in conflict with birth to 18, because now we're being challenged by the people we meet, the different languages we hear, you know, different lifestyles that we're unfamiliar with. But yet we want to know and be curious about these 18 to 24-year-old tapes. But at the same time, well, no, my parents said, don't look a person in the eye, or don't touch that person's hair, or just touch that person's hair, or whatever those experiences may be. But from 24 on, now you get to recreate this whole new life. And now you have to make a decision. Do I listen to my 18 to 20-year-old tapes to where I'm learning something new, I'm embracing differences, I'm embracing similarities, or do I go back to my birth to 18 where I am comfortable? I'm gonna stay comfortable. I will remain comfortable. I'm all about listen to your 18 to 24, you're 24 on, because now you're suspending judgment, just like you said at the beginning of the show, suspend judgment. I'm going to be curious, and I know I'm saying that word a lot, curious, because I am curious about people. I really am, and I want to know more about you. If you're a white person, I'm not going to make the assumption you're from Manhattan. I'm not going to make the assumption you're from the state of Kansas, because unfortunately, that's our box in Manhattan, Kansas. You're either from the state of Kansas or you're somewhere near the town of Manhattan, which you are from. And if your experiences are that limited, then you're not going to be able to get to move forward. You're not going to be able to have those difficult conversations. Or should I say, it will be difficult to have those conversations because you don't know. And my thing is, you need to give yourself permission to know. It's okay if you do not know, but give yourself permission to ask those idiom questions, not sounding ignorant, but sounding more curious, because you're trying to learn. If I have a white person come up to me and ask, one of those idiom questions, for me, I look at it as, oh, here's a teachable moment. Let me take advantage of it, because I want to educate you. I don't want to embarrass you. I don't want you to feel short-sighted in my responses. I want to educate you. And that's how we have to approach these things. Let's educate each other cautiously.
I'll go. So the question was, how do you have these conversations? I forgot, Donna, what was the exact? Unmute. I can't hear you.
Much of our conversations that are spontaneous are idiomatic. Where are you from? Amongst relative strangers. Or tell me what happened. Who were you with? Describe that person. And what happened then. The way we talk in an everyday way amongst relative strangers or peers gives, as Ms. Stoney's been saying, that opportunity. That
Right.
there are always these opportunities. How are you handling those?
So yeah, I think, again, I'm going to reference back to my teaching days when I was in first grade. I walked in with a lot of assumptions. So when I taught first grade at Ogden Elementary School, I didn't know what to expect. I'm very biased. I was in my 30s and being raised very differently, as Dr. Stoney was saying. I had my own assumptions, but it was a learning process for me to have those conversations as well, especially when you have parent-teacher conferences. Parents walk in already knowing who are you teaching my children? Why isn't there a white person teaching my children? And because at first grade, they're pretty impressionable. And that has actually happened where parents have gone to my principal at the time and said, why do you have, at that time, there was an African-American first grade teacher as well. Why isn't there a white teacher teaching my kids? And so you know they've already judged you before they even met you. So my job is to not only get rid of that stereotype, but let them know your kid's going to get the best education possible in my classroom. And here's why. So those conversations have that building trust is the foundation, acceptance, trust, and knowing that what I've learned is that parents and individuals want to know that you like their child. Grades are important, academics is important, but do you care? Do you care about my kid? Will you care them when I'm not around? Will you care them no matter what happens in my family, or will you judge them? And that was a learning experience for me, where caring and loving and trust were three critical words that I had to make sure parents understood our relationship. And that has worked well for me. And that's what's made me, I feel, a better leader. And at 54, I'm still learning. I'm not where I need to be. I am still learning. But at the same time, the skills I have is to have that dialogue with people without, one, making them not have to feel like getting defensive, or having them to feel like they have to somehow, they are less of a person because of their thoughts. When I walk in a room, yes, you see a woman of color, but you also see a woman that's from a different religion. I'm comfortable in my skin. I am comfortable with who I am, and I'm comfortable being in the room with everybody else that's not like me. And that's important. And once you remove that ease and you become accessible, I am open to any type of dialogue they want to have. So when people do approach me and say, where are you from? How long have you been here? I don't take it offensively. I take that as just them being curious. And we can't assume everybody has a college education or is in business or has graduated from high school, or we don't know their background. They might be from foster care. They may have had, we don't know what their life experiences are. So the tools they have to ask a question should not be judged if they are curious. What concerns me are the ones that never ask anything, and the ones that have no curiosity to ask you in the worst possible way. They just don't care. And that worries me a great deal. When people, when I knock on doors as I was campaigning, I knocked on all doors, whether they were of the same political affiliation or not. And what I realized is once they got to know me, they liked me. And they didn't know they would like me until they got to know me. So you just have to go on with that conversation and not, I can't have assumptions about them and they can't have assumptions about me. The best thing is to create that conversation and then decide, you know, I had a conversation with you, and this happened when I was walking. I like you, but I'm not sure I'm going to vote for you, which is great. Now you're deciding that based on knowing me. Or, hey, I didn't know who you were, but now I'm going to vote for you because I kind of agree with the things you're saying. But that conversation needs to happen on their terms as well as your terms as adults, because outside the classroom, the world is very different. The Manhattan community has an array of people, and I value that discussion and being accessible and available for that discussion when they are ready. When you try to push something like on a teenager, and if they're not ready, they're not going to care. My kids right now think that when they were growing up, they didn't care for any systems I had in place at home as far as rules. Now they're saying they would be more strict than I would. So, you know, now they're at a level, had a few life experiences thinking, I know why she did what she did. So that needs to happen on their timetable though. You know, now they understand it. So when you come to that point, you can have that. Now we can talk about Black Lives Matter and the context that it was meant, as opposed to just it's a race issue. We can actually have that discussion, and that took hundreds of years to get here. But I think people are ready for that. So yeah.
Well, I'm glad you're talking about timetables. This is an election year, and people know that they're going to be making choices. They're also saying, let's not wait for the election. Let's start proposing changes now. And they're formally setting up to change policy. CCR creates these conversations because ultimately they're to produce positive change. In this context, we've been talking about conversations that are responsive, reactive, proactive, but where we want to see Manhattan go. I've already heard some ideas on what you want to see Manhattan change to, but let's actually talk about what at a policy level, at an institutional level, needs to change very specifically. Yes, Mr. Van Dyke. Unmute first, yeah.
Yes. I'm just, so one of my biggest, he was my pastor. His name was Dr. James Boyer at Fellowship Temple. He encouraged me a lot. That's a reason why I took some of the platforms that I did. And, you know, after seeing how much change he had done in the community, whether it was at K-State, whether it was in the church, whether it was on the streets of Manhattan, that's what inspired me. So some of the changes on the diversity committee that me and Mayor Reddi are on, one thing that I have always pushed for is cultural competency training for the teachers. I think that is so essential because then the teachers who are teaching the students are able to know the different histories, the different backgrounds. And with them knowing that as the head of the classroom, they can trickle that down to the students of the classroom. You know, they are able to have those conversations and look at it from different perspectives. But I just think I always encourage people, you don't have to be on the streets protesting. You don't have to be posting on social media to get your voice heard. If you want your voice to be heard, join boards, join committees, join different organizations that you can have a voice. You can speak up, whether you're representing yourself or trying to represent a body of people. But there's different opportunities where you can join. Whether it's on your job, you know, we just need more people, as I said before, who are willing to speak up and speak out. And I think, but piggyback into that cultural competency training, you know, like I said, it starts in our homes, it starts in our schools. I think those minimal starts can help lead to big things. So,
What other particular sectoral changes or institutional changes would you like to see happen?
Yeah, so, you know, policies are what I work on. And one of the things we try to do is be as inclusive as possible. And some of the policies have unintended consequences, and I want to try to avoid that. So I am looking at setting up a diversity and inclusion advisory board, which would work not just on issues such as this, but on policies. I want them to be intricately involved in our policies for public safety, housing, infrastructure, businesses, chamber, access to economic development funds. We don't have that going on right now because we just have nothing set up in that area. So this is something that I want to move forward, because it's not, we have a human rights and services board, and their task, I believe, is if somebody complains of discrimination, whether it's in the LGBT community or other sectors, they would go to them. This advisory board is to guide us in our policies and advise city council, city commission, and others, such as the Manhattan Planning Urban Board would do for housing and rezoning. This would work on all of our policies, and that's what we need. And this takes people that are familiar with those sectors, because we often they don't have access to economic development funds. If you're doing a startup or something like that, you may not know what we have accessible for you. You may not know if businesses are coming in, how you can play a role in that business. And these are the barriers we can remove so that other people, and in every community, all of our people will have access to that. And right now, that's the absent voice. And this is something I want all commissioners to have in place, so we make the right decisions that are inclusive of an entire body, as opposed to a few people that might have a lot of money. And to assume that all African Americans are poor or don't have an education, that's an assumption that needs to be just shot out of the water, because that is just not true. What we do have is, we don't have them having access to these systems that everybody else might have access to. And that's where you break that systemic racism. If they have access to it, we will have more people wanting to come to Manhattan, establish communities here, have businesses here that cater to a variety of populations. And I think that's the way I would like to see some of these policies working out. And that's the place I envision for Manhattan, having them at the table. And Kansas State University has groups that work on these policies all the time. Recruitment and retaining, that's huge, whether it's with the RCPD or whether it's in our city offices. And I cannot be the only woman on a city commission. I know it has to be more women than myself, more people of color. We just need more of that. And voting is so key. That's the power. You need to not only register to vote, you got to go vote, because somebody else is voting and somebody's paying a lot of other people to vote for interests that matter to them. This is a self-interest thing. So you don't have to be ideological. You have to see, what does that candidate have to offer me? Because that's how all the other people are voting. It doesn't have to be a constituency thing. It has to be about a you thing. And that's the only way. You have the power, you have the control, and you have to use it. And don't let somebody else use it for you, because that's what's happening right now. Individuals are making decisions for you, and you don't know who they are or what they're doing.
Representative democracy has its challenges.
Yes.
Professor Stoney?
Yes, I just want to say something to the policies that Mayor Reddi was talking about. Yes, policies are very important, but we also have to remember that, you know, we could change policies, we could implement policies, but what we also need to do is change the behaviors and attitudes in which those policies are being implemented. Second, I want, you know, as far as those policies, and you talked to, Mayor Reddi talked about recruit and retention. Well, if we recruit and retain, to recruit and retain in Manhattan, there has to be a welcoming community. And if it's not a welcoming community, that really hurts us as a community, as far as those businesses, as far as those policy changes, as far as accessing what, others have those opportunities, same opportunities others could have. We have to be able to make sure that we're conscious. See, right now we're an unconscious people, but now that we're woke, we're thinking we are conscious, but this is just the start of being conscious, being literate, culturally literate, I should add, as Mr. Van Dyke mentioned. We have to be proactive in what we're doing, not reactive. And by being proactive, what I'm saying is your action will your actions will put into your words and what you are doing, as opposed to not zero action. We have to also understand that, diversity, we need to see it as a strength and not as a weakness. Because when we see it as a strength, we can come together as a community of one and not a community of many.
You are all three so profound. You have given me so much food for thought. I realize we're running out of time, but I wanted to invite each of you to write down in the chat something that has been said here that sticks to you, that you're going to walk away thinking about, just as a parking spot for yourself and for all of us. Some thought summarized, or a brief phrase, or even one idea that is sticking to you. And then I'm going to have one go around as to what or who inspires you to carry this forward. And I'll say that all three of you inspire me. While you're thinking about the thought that sticks, I want to thank you all. Mr. Van Dyke, you were an inspiration to me when you were a junior. I thought, there's hope for the future if someone this young is this sophisticated in his relationships with other people. And Professor Stoney, I loved the way you responded to that tense moment when faculty were saying, how am I going to handle this in my class? And just launched the brown bag discussion. And of course, Mayor Reddi, you have a focus and a poise, even when things get hot in public conversation, that allows people to simply slow down. I've seen you practice it over and over again. When the rapid fire gets too rapid, you know how to use the pause and slowly deliver what you're hearing and how you're responding in an honest and a very deliberate fashion that just allows people to think again, think some more. So you guys are my models. Yeah, just a quick summary. What's inspiring or who inspiring you to carry this work forward? And then we'll close it up.
I'll try to be brief. What inspired me to carry this conversation is the fact that I work in our teacher education program, and that I'm part of a faculty that prepares future teachers for the classroom. I want to make sure that our teachers are prepared and ready to work with the diverse types of students that enter into the classroom, and that they can understand the experiences, the cultural experiences these kids bring into the classroom, but also understand their own personal cultural experiences of who they are, their identities as well. And for me, that's what keeps me going, because when I see those changes when they come into the program very early to their exit and graduation into the classrooms, it says to me, we're doing our job. So they are the one that, when I go to work, I don't see it as work. It's a fun position to be in, but it's also a great position to be in, because I'm impacting lives. And if I can impact change that way, I've done my job one person at a time.
Thank you.
I think for me, this isn't a one-time thing. This is it feels like this is what I've been wanting to do all the time, and this is what I do like I said, as a teacher, as a mom, and now as an elected official. I've always felt like and something I try to do is always work like somebody's watching you. And if I always feel like somebody's watching me, I want to be at my best all the time. And sometimes that can be exhausting. because you know people are listening and they're looking, some may be looking at one or two things to bring you down with as opposed to lift you with. So you're very cautious of that. But at the same time, I'm put in this place for a reason. I'm put in this position for a reason. And every time I get a chance to speak, and this has been true for all 7 years on the city commission, I take advantage of it. People invite you and I have the option to say yes or no. And I try to say yes as often as possible, because you only get one chance to get it right with some folks and one chance to have them hear you. And I use every chance I have to break a barrier. And you can't just be a one and done kind of thing. You just never know when a certain person is listening. So you need to constantly stay on message and preach and continue to lead, like I said, by example, constantly pulling people in. They may not hear you today, they may not hear you tomorrow, but they may hear you at some point. So the lesson needs to continue till they start hearing you. And each time it's going to be a different person, a different organization. Somebody's going to start listening. And that's when you create that movement. And that's how you create change. And I'm so thankful for people like Mr. Van Dyke that is now a leader. And one day probably will run for office, hopefully. And there's going to be a lot of people going with him. And we are all here on shoulders of so many, and we have so much more work to do. And I love what I do. I love what I do. I have one life, and I want to make sure I provide a foundation for as many people to be successful and to be heard and to thrive as possible. And I work very well with people like Dr. Stoney and the individuals in my community. People may not like the decisions I make or may not like some of the things I do, but I do feel respected. And I feel I've earned that respect, and I will continue to speak for issues I believe in. I am true to myself, and this is what you see is what you get. This isn't a fake story here. But I also believe in pulling in as many people as possible, because this is a we thing and not a me thing.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay. Donna just phoned while you were talking. You saw her disappear from the screen. She had a power outage and has disappeared on us. But I think we were at you guys know me, I'm Suzanne Gleemore, and we were at a point of wrapping up, and those were beautiful final words, I think. I would like your permission to take some of the nuggets that came from this conversation and that are in the chat, that you guys placed in the chat, as little springboards for further conversation that I will add when we post the video online for the community to listen. Is that okay with all of you? Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for being part of this. We hope that we'll continue to talk with you, each of you, as we continue our series of conversations throughout the rest of the summer. There she is, she's back. We were just wrapping up. Because we believe that there's value to the larger conversation, but there's also a lot of value in these small conversations, that we can take some of these nuggets that we heard from each of you and continue to connect the dots in our small conversations, but in all of the conversations that are happening in our community too. You guys had mentioned the importance of sustaining conversation, and so that's part of what we're trying to do, and we hope you'll continue to join us in that. Donna, did you want to have any final word before we wrap things up? We're about at the end of time. It's 11.
Thank you again, and I'm sorry, I heard a sudden blip and then the electricity went out and then came back on. So it's a good job. Thank you so much, everybody. And I am so looking forward to talking individually with each of the three of you as soon as it can be arranged. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Be well.
You too.